Here we'll start with an overview of carbon inputs to ecosystems. Photosynthesis is the process by which most carbon and chemical energy enter ecosystems. Now, carbon can enter ecosystems through other means besides photosynthesis. For example, it can become a carbonate that we talked about in soils, but that's not organic carbon. That's an inorganic form of carbon. And we can also put chemical energy into ecosystems through processes besides photosynthesis, but in general, photosynthesis is the predominant process by which carbon and chemical energy enter ecosystems. Carbon uptake by plants is termed photosynthesis, and this tends to be measured at the leaf scale. When we want to think about photosynthesis at the scale of ecosystems, we call this gross primary production, or GPP is the abbreviation that we use. It's gross and not net, which means that we're thinking about how much uptake there is before loss, and it's primary production, which is the uptake of carbon and the production of carbohydrates, for example. But it's not secondary production because we're not thinking about its consumption by other organisms. So if we think about GPP, or if we say gross primary production, think about it as ecosystem scale photosynthesis. Now, what generates variation in GPP? Well, there's temporal variation in GPP for a given ecosystem, and that's driven by variation in light or temperature, nitrogen availability in the soils, for example. In addition, there's spatial variation in GPP. For example, the amount of leaf biomass varies across ecosystems. Some ecosystems have more leaves than others. In some ecosystems, leaves are maintained in that ecosystem for longer than in other ecosystems. And this spatial variation in quantity and duration of photosynthetic biomass drives differences among ecosystems in gross primary production. Now, to understand some of the basic patterns in GPP, we're going to use the state factor and interactive control approach again. Here's figure 5.2, and we've seen figures like this before where we're trying to understand variation, in this case, in GPP. Now, there are proximal controls or direct controls, such as leaf area. The more leaf area you have, the greater the impact on GPP. The more nitrogen that is present in a plant, the greater the GPP. And the longer the season is, the greater the GPP. Size of the arrows here influence the relative importance of these direct controls on GPP. So temperature, light, and CO2 impact GPP, but not as much as leaf area, for example, or nitrogen concentrations in the leaf, or how long the growing season is. So these are the direct controls, and directly, GPP is going to be determined by leaf area, nitrogen, and season length. Now, the interactive controls, what determines how much leaf area you have, or nitrogen, really has to do with plant functional types and soil resources. And those are the primary determinants of how much leaf area you have, for example. And again, on the state factor side, you can imagine how the biota, the potential biota, impacts what plant functional types you have. And ecosystem development also would determine how many soil resources there are. One important factor here is to think about climate. And we can think that in a cold place or a hot place, you would have differences in GPP. But the primary impact of climate on GPP happens through season length, and the longer the season, the greater the GPP. And it's not as much a direct effect, temperature or light, for example, on GPP. It's indirect through season length. And climate also impacts soil resources. So cold places, for example, have less soil resources, less leaf area and nitrogen as a result of it, and lower GPP. But it's not necessarily a direct impact of climate on temperature on GPP. So in some cases, there's indirect controls of climate on GPP through soil resources, plant functional types you have, and then it's primarily leaf area and the nitrogen concentration of those leaves and how long that season is that determines GPP across ecosystems. Now, plants reduce carbon. If you remember oxidation and reduction equations, plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, add electrons to it, and reduce it, make it more energetic. And they do this for a couple of reasons. One, it's a very good place to store energy that can be then used later for metabolic purposes. But also, plants reduce carbon to build structures. Much of the plant and much of the biomass of a plant is structural. It serves the purpose of holding up other parts and allowing plants to photosynthesize and eventually produce seeds. Now, when we take a look at plants and we want to think about how much energy might be in an ecosystem or in the plant portion of the ecosystem, we might take a look at how much biomass there is. And the energy content of different tissues is pretty similar. So if we're to compare leaves and roots, for example, and determine the energy content of those, so how much energy is being stored in a leaf versus a root versus a stem, it turns out it's pretty similar. So this here is a comparison of leaves, stems, seeds, and roots of 3 different classes of plants: needle-leaf trees, conifers, pine trees, broadleaf trees, like deciduous trees, and then herbs, so grasses and other plants that don't have woody parts to it. And this, on the y-axis, is energy content. The units here are kilojoules per gram, so how much energy is stored in a gram of biomass. And if you take a look, for all intents and purposes, leaves, stems, seeds, roots are all relatively well constrained, give or take 10 or 20%. Now there's some exceptions on this with respect to seeds, because some seeds have a lot of lipids in them, and lipids are a very energy dense compound. But for the most part, the energy content of different plant biomass is more or less the same. It takes as much energy to produce a leaf as it does to produce a root or a stem. Now, remembering that we said that organic matter is primarily almost half carbon, 45% carbon, there are differences among the different types of organic matter. So wood, for example, has a slightly higher carbon concentration, 50%. But for the most part, not only do different plant parts and different plants have similar energy content, they also have similar carbon content. If you were to just take a look at a gram of leaf or stem or root. And as a consequence, often in ecosystem ecology, we'll use different currencies when we're describing the amount of energy that's in an ecosystem. Sometimes it might get referred to as kilojoules and how many megajoules might be in a place. But other times, we're just going to quantify the mass of carbon, or maybe the moles of carbon. Sometimes we'll just talk about biomass. There's this many kilograms of plant material after it's been dried, and those would serve as our currencies. And because the energy content of different plant biomass is more or less the same, and the carbon concentrations are more or less the same, either between 45 to 50%. Again, that's about a 10% variation across major types of tissues. So in those cases, we can talk about energy content, we can talk about carbon concentrations or carbon content, or we can talk about biomass. And each of those serves as a pretty good currency for describing how much energy is stored within an ecosystem.